Hello, Father James. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me here.
It's great to see you. And you're talking to us from Washington, D.C., from the Catholic University of America Canon Law faculty. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's great to be talking to you. And you're going to talk a little bit about some of the canonical structures for former Anglicans in the Catholic Church. And you yourself are an ordinariate priest, aren't you?
That's right. Yes, I became a Catholic in 2011 and was ordained and became a deacon and then a priest of the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham in England.
Great. Well, it's great to have you here. So, well, in our society, we've got people from all different sorts of backgrounds. So some will be more or less familiar with what happened 10 or 11 years ago. So why don't you start with giving a little bit of background to what the Ordinariates are all about?
Sure. So primarily, we're talking about a structure which came about in England, at least, in 2011. And before that, in 2009, in October 2009, an announcement came out saying that this apostolic constitution, a legal document, was going to be promulgated and published. And that this would open the way for personal ordinariates to be established, to be erected in the Catholic Church, so that groups of former Anglicans could come into the Catholic Church whilst retaining certain elements of their liturgical, spiritual and pastoral traditions. So both individual and corporate reunion, in a sense.
Sure. So prior to that, Anglicans becoming Catholics came as individuals, became Catholics. And so what you're talking about is new structures and that corporate way in which groups could come. That was something new. Yes,
that's right. So, I mean, still it's the case, obviously, that someone becoming a Catholic has to make an individual submission of the will and to decide that they want to become a Catholic individually, but they can now do so as part of a group of people. And when they become Catholic, stay together as a group. Mm-hmm. So I came, for instance, from a parish in Kent, and there were about 40 of us who were received together into the Catholic Church and remained together for some time as a group in the Catholic Church.
Right, sure.
So in 2009, on the 4th of November 2009, Pope Benedict XVI signed the Apostolic Constitution Anglicanorum Jetibus, which is never far from my reach. And it became public later that year in November, and the first ordinariate was established in England and Wales in 2011, and then subsequent ordinariates in the United States in 2012 and in Australia in June 2012, so later that year.
Right, so there are 3 ordinariates.
That's correct.
Across the world, right. And so at the moment, you're in the USA, where there's one ordinariate. You've come from the Ordinariate of England and Wales.
That's right, yeah. And because it's a personal jurisdiction, we can get into this a little bit, but because it's a personal jurisdiction, I remain a subject of the Ordinariate in which I'm incardinated as a priest and of which I'm also a member as a member of the Christian faithful.
Do you want to talk about some of the canon law in that document, Anglicanorum Jetibus?
Sure. So first of all, there's the document itself. So whenever we talk about canon law in the Catholic Church, we think of the universal law of the Church, and obviously we think about the Code of Canon Law, but there's also other universal law that's promulgated by the supreme authority of the Church, so the Roman Pontiff and the College of Bishops, and an apostolic constitution, which is issued by the Pope, by the supreme legislator, is part of the universal law of the Church. Anglicanorum Jetibus, the document that allows for the erection of personal ordinariates, is part of the universal law of the Church. It's an apostolic constitution, and it allows for the erection of personal ordinariates. It doesn't do that itself. People often think when we talk about Anglicanorum Jetibus that we're talking about the document that produced the ordinariates. It opened the door to it, but it didn't actually establish them. Mm-hmm. Alongside the Apostolic Constitution are a set of complementary norms issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And these really guide the implementation of the law. So the Apostolic Constitution is a juridical document, and the complementary norms guide its implementation. And they're also changeable in that sense, because the law, you don't want to be changing law every 5 minutes. Bad law needs to be changed. but the norms for implementation can be changed according to changes in circumstance. And those complementary norms have been changed actually twice, once on the 29th of May 2013, where a new article, a new paragraph of an article was inserted, and then a substantial revision last year, 2019, the 10th anniversary of the Apostolic Constitution. But then in addition to that, we're talking also about the document that erects the particular personal ordinariate. So the decree of erection is the formal term, which is issued by the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in order that the ordinariate, the specific ordinariate, comes into being. Mm-hmm. So those are the kind of legal documents that we're talking about: the Apostolic Constitution and its complementary norms, and then also the decree of erection, and of course any particular law that might exist in a specific ordinariate.
Right, absolutely. And that specific law in a particular ordinariate, is that quite dominant, or are the norms across the ordinariates mainly quite similar?
So each of the ordinariates, like any diocese in a sense, has the opportunity to promulgate its own law, and the three ordinariates have done that in different ways and to different degrees so far. Right.
Well, I think you've mentioned a few times the ordinariate. Is it worth saying what ordinariate actually means?
Yeah, sure. So we talk about these ordinariates, these structures, as personal ordinariates. That's the phrase that's used in the law. And I think, first of all, it's best just to kind of go back to first principles. What do we mean by personal, and what do we mean by ordinariate? So, as I'm sure most viewers will know, most jurisdictions are delineated by territory. So you live in the Diocese of Brentwood, and you know you live in the Diocese of Brentwood because somebody has drawn that on a map and said, this is the Diocese of Brentwood. And if you live on one side of the boundary, you're in it, and if you live on the other side, you're not. Most jurisdictions in the Catholic Church work like that. But there's also the opportunity for jurisdiction to be personal rather than territorial. That means that it's attached to a person. An individual or a group of people can be identified by the law and can have jurisdiction, rights and duties given to them by the competent authority. And that's what we're talking about here. In a sense, it doesn't matter where you live in England and Wales. If you are a member of the ordinariate, you are a member of the ordinariate everywhere. So those borders don't exist in the same way. It's a personal affiliation. I would just want to say, though, that these things aren't distinct, territorial and personal. Whenever we talk about personal jurisdiction, there's always some territorial element. So I like to describe this as a geographical element rather than territorial, because territorial is a kind of precise canonical term. But we can talk about the personal jurisdiction being delineated geographically. So if you live in England and Wales, then when you join a personal ordinariate, you join the one in England and Wales. If you live in the United States, you join the one in the United States. So there's always a geographical element to it as well. And we know about personal jurisdiction from things like Roman law. You know, if you think about a Roman citizen, wherever they are, they're a Roman citizen. And in England, you can think of, you know, situations in legal history where someone commits a crime in England, they run overseas, but they're still subject to punishment back in England because they're a citizen. So there's a personal element to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or taxation.
Oh, right. You can never get away from taxation. That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. So does the word ordinariate, is that the ordinary in the ordinariate, that is the ordinary of the ordinariate, who would be equivalent to the bishop in a diocese?
That's a good question. So when we talk about an ordinary, we don't necessarily just mean the diocesan bishop. We also mean anyone who has ordinary jurisdiction. And when we talk about an ordinariate, it's headed by a man called an ordinary, who may or may not be in episcopal orders. And we can talk about the specific sort of jurisdiction and power of the ordinary, of the personal ordinariate in a moment, perhaps. But just on the ordinariate itself, because most people are familiar with a diocese, but don't really know what an ordinariate is. So personal jurisdiction isn't new, and neither is the idea of an ordinariate. They've existed in some way in the Catholic Church for quite a while. and in modern times really came about as a result of the work of Pius XII, who did some work on this before he became Pope. And he was very keen on both ensuring that the clergy were distributed properly, and also that migrants were taken care of when they went overseas, and so on and so forth. So you find him using personal jurisdiction to accommodate this. He also set up the military vicariates, which are kind of forerunners to the military ordinariates set up by John Paul II, and they take care of members of the armed forces. In England, we call it the bishopric of the armed forces, but that's just terminology, and in the United States, it's called the archdiocese of the military services. But they are, in fact, both ordinariates, and they exist in slightly different ways from the ordinariates that take care of migrants, and also there are ordinariates that take care of members of the Eastern churches in Latin territory where there's no Eastern jurisdiction being established, where there's no hierarchy. In fact, today I noticed in the Bolletino from the Holy See, there was the appointment of a new apostolic administrator for the ordinariate for Armenian Catholics resident in Romania, which means that there's an ordinariate established to look after Armenian Catholics, a Latin jurisdiction, in Romania, because there's no Armenian hierarchy in Romania. Mm-hmm. So these are not new structures, and particularly we're familiar with the idea mainly through the military ordinariates.
Sure. And you mentioned there the Eastern Catholic churches, and is it worth saying something about the fact that the ordinariates, the personal ordinariates you're talking about for former Anglicans, they are, I think I'm right in saying, they're part of the Latin Church. They're not another church like the Eastern Catholic Church. That's
absolutely right. So there have been various proposals for Anglican reunion with the Catholic Church over the years, and perhaps the most famous in recent years was that of Aidan Nichols in The Panther and the Hind, and he proposed that the reunion of Anglicans should take place through the form of a ritual church, what we now properly call a church sui juris. But the decision was taken not to do that for two reasons. Firstly, because the origins of Anglicanism come from within the Latin Church, mm-hmm. and it would be a novelty to create a new church sui juris that is Latin. There's only one Latin church, the rest are Eastern. And also, and this is an important factor, when we look at the gifts, the treasures to be shared, as the document puts it, the liturgical, pastoral, and spiritual traditions, it talks about them both for the members of the ordinariates and as a gift to be shared, a treasure to be shared. Well, that can only be the case, particularly liturgically, if it's within the same church sui juris. Otherwise, you get into issues of syncretism and things like that.
Right.
So it's a positive thing, I think.
No, that's really interesting. So do you want to go on to talk a little bit about the powers of the ordinary and how things sort of work on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So a diocesan bishop has power in the diocese which is given to him, and it's ordinary, it's proper, and it's immediate. The ordinary of a personal ordinariate has that in a slightly different way. So Article 5 describes it as ordinary, vicarious, and personal. So he has ordinary power, but he has it vicariously on behalf of someone else. In this case, he exercises it in the name of the Roman Pontiff. And then it's personal in that it relates to the individuals who are members. It doesn't relate to everybody who lives within the territory. So there's a distinction, whether or not the ordinary is in episcopal orders, there's a distinction between the power of the ordinary of the personal ordinariate and the power of the diocesan bishop. But there's also the way in which that interaction between the ordinariate and the local diocese happens as well. I can just perhaps say something briefly about that. So with the military ordinariates, which we spoke about a moment ago, the document talks about cumulative jurisdiction. That is to say, the ordinary, the military ordinary, and the diocesan bishop work together in a cumulative way. Their power is cumulative. With the personal ordinary and the diocesan bishop, they're to be exercised jointly. Now, that might seem to be a distinction without a difference, but it's a very important distinction in that it says that they're to be exercised jointly in areas defined by the law. So you have to then look to see what it says and where it says those powers are to be exercised jointly. But it's a distinction. It's not the same as cumulative jurisdiction. It's a distinction. It means that the ordinary of the person ordinariate is able to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over his subjects in a way that's distinct from the military ordinariate, for instance.
Sure. And how would you say that this manifests itself on the ground in the, I'm not sure if parishes is the right word, but in the local worshipping community at Mass on a Sunday and the pastoral relationships?
Sure. You mean in terms of the relationship between the ordinariate and the local diocese, particularly?
Yeah.
So what we do have parishes, we have parishes, personal parishes again, because right. Although they have a geographical boundary, it's not everyone who lives there, it's the members of the ordinariate who are members of the parish. But on the whole, the relationship exists in a very positive way, because the Catholic Church, contrary to what some people might think, is not uniform in the way that it carries out its pastoral duties. So, if you think about London, for instance, you have the Archdiocese of Westminster, but you also have the Ukrainian cathedral right in the heart of it. You also in England have the Syro-Malabar Eparchy, which is another church sui juris jurisdiction of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. So we're quite used to dealing with people who don't fit into the territorial reality or even in the same church sui juris. And on the whole, I think that works quite well.
Great, so that's really interesting to hear. And I suppose perhaps one perhaps as we get towards the end, one thing that people might be interested in, people often are, is the question of liturgy, because I believe I believe there are particular liturgies that the Ordinariate uses, which are a little bit different from the usual Roman rite that the rest of the Latin Church uses. That's right. So Article 3 of the Apostolic Constitution says that the Ordinariate has the faculty to celebrate the Holy Eucharist and other sacraments, the Liturgy of the Hours, liturgical celebrations according to the liturgical books proper to the Anglican tradition approved by the Holy See. And there have been 3 liturgical books promulgated so far: Divine Worship Occasional Services, which contains rites of marriage, funerals, and weddings, Hatch, Match, and Dispatch. We've got the Missal, Divine Worship, the Missal, and also the Pastoral Care of the Sick and Dying. And we're also at this stage now in the final sort of phases of putting together the Ordinariate Office Book, which will be very familiar to people who know the Anglican Matins and Evensong pattern. So those particular liturgical texts and the law that accompanies them is another part of our legal life in that sense. Sure. And I suppose just thinking again how things work on the ground, one question that a lot of people might have is what happens about married Anglican clergy who become Catholics? Is that something, canonically speaking, that's contemplated in the texts? Yeah, so the Catholic Church has received into full communion and subsequently ordained clergy from other communions, other ecclesial communities who are married for 70 years, since the 1950s at least, and before that there are examples of it, but certainly particularly since the 50s. Again, Pius XII was particularly significant in bringing that about. And the norms that we follow in the Ordinariates are the same norms that were promulgated in the 1980s to deal with the influx of former Anglican clergy into the Catholic Church in the United States, the so-called pastoral provision. So it's very similar to that. The norms that exist at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith govern how we deal with former Anglican clergy who are married, who wish to be received and then ordained in the Catholic Church. And we have had some exceptions as well. So we've had 1 or 2 situations where somebody wasn't ordained in the Church of England or in an Anglican body, but who has come into the Catholic Church and been married and has requested ordination, and that's been granted for very particular and specific reasons. One guy, for instance, was at the end of his formation in theological college and hadn't actually received ordination in the Church of England, but decided to become a Catholic, and the Holy See said, you followed your conscience, we want to respect that. So. Sure. No, that's fascinating. Well, I mean, this has been so interesting. I really feel like we could go on for hours with this conversation, we should probably draw things a little bit to a close, James, and perhaps you come back on another occasion, we could continue the conversation, or maybe find out more about the Canon Law faculty over there in Washington DC as well, which sounds like a fascinating place.
I'd love to. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for all the work that the Ecclesiastical Law Society does.
Great. Well, thanks for talking to us. See you soon.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Bless. Bye.